There is a specific kind of loneliness that arrives not from failure, not from rejection, not from being left behind, but from having grown, from having done the work that most people avoid their entire lives, from having descended into your own unconscious, faced what lived there, and returned changed in ways that cannot be undone. You expected that process to open you, and it did. But what no one told you, what the books on individuation carefully omit, is that the opening comes at a cost, that the expansion of the inner world often contracts the outer one, that becoming more fully yourself can make you profoundly, structurally alone. You notice it first in conversations. The topics that used to hold your attention for hours now feel thin. The complaints that once drew your empathy now feel circular. The same wound, the same story, the same refusal to look beneath the surface. You try to meet people where they are. You remind yourself that everyone moves at their own pace. You practice patience and presence. But underneath the effort, something in you has shifted so fundamentally that certain exchanges leave you more depleted than a day of physical labor. Not because the people are bad, but because the distance between where you are and where they are has become, quietly and without drama, enormous. The relationships that suffer first are often the oldest ones, the friendships built in adolescence, when shared suffering was the primary bonding agent. The family dynamics that were constructed around a version of you that no longer exists. The compliant one, the invisible one, the one who absorbed the household's anxiety so that everyone else could feel stable. When you stop playing that role, when you refuse to carry what was never yours to carry, the system destabilizes. People who loved the function you performed experience your growth as abandonment. They do not say this directly. They say you have changed. They say you think you are better than everyone now. They say you used to be more fun. What makes this particular loneliness so difficult to navigate is that it arrives disguised as ingratitude. You have been given something, clarity, depth, a more honest relationship with your own reality. And yet you are grieving. From the outside, this looks like ingratitude. From the inside, it feels like standing in a room that has been thoroughly cleaned and discovering that the cleaning removed not just the dirt but several people you loved. The grief is real. The loss is real. And it deserves to be named as loss, not reframed as liberation, not minimized as the necessary price of growth, but acknowledged as something that genuinely hurts. This video is for the people who are living inside that specific grief right now. The ones who have done the inner work and are discovering that the inner work has outer consequences no one prepared them for. Jung wrote extensively about individuation, but was characteristically sparse about its social cost. Perhaps because to name it too clearly would be to discourage the very process he believed was essential to genuine human development. But you are already in it, and what you need now is not encouragement to keep going. What you need is to understand what is actually happening and why it was, in some difficult and important sense, inevitable. Individuation, as Jung conceived it, is not self-improvement. It is not the optimization of the existing self, the making of a better, more functional, more successful version of who you already are. It is something far more radical and far more disorienting than that. It is the process by which the constructed self, the persona, the social mask, the identity built through years of adaptation to family, culture, and expectation, begins to crack. And through those cracks, something older and more essential begins to emerge. Not a better version of the person you were performing, a different person entirely. One who was always there, waiting beneath the performance. The persona, in Jungian psychology, is the identity we construct for social survival. It is built from genuine aspects of the self, but it is also built from borrowed values, inherited fears, and the accumulated wisdom of what gets rewarded and what gets punished in the specific environment we grew up in. The persona learns to emphasize the qualities that earn love and to suppress the qualities that earn rejection. Over time, the persona becomes so habitual, so automatic, so deeply identified with, that we stop experiencing it as a construction. We experience it as ourselves, and so when individuation begins to dissolve the persona, when the unconscious begins pushing through with its own demands, its own truth, its own vision of who this person is supposed to be, it does not feel like liberation. It feels like a breakdown. The social self that other people know is primarily the persona. Your friends, your family, your colleagues, they have built their relationship with you on the basis of the persona's consistent behavior. They know how you respond to conflict. They know what topics you avoid. They know the version of you that shows up reliably to fulfill certain relational functions. When individuation begins, that reliability starts to erode. You respond differently to situations that used to produce predictable reactions. You stop avoiding the topics you previously avoided. You begin expressing needs, setting limits, and refusing dynamics that you previously absorbed in silence. From the outside, this looks like instability. It looks like you are becoming someone unpredictable, difficult, or, the word people reach for most often, different. What is actually happening is that the gap between the persona and the genuine self is closing. The distance between who you perform and who you are is shrinking. And this is psychologically healthy, deeply necessary, and socially destabilizing all at once. Because the social world was calibrated to the persona. The relationships, the roles, the unspoken contracts, all of it was built around the constructed self. When the constructed self begins to dissolve in favor of something more authentic, the social architecture built around it becomes structurally unsound. Some of it will need to be rebuilt. Some of it will simply collapse. And the process of distinguishing which is one of the most painful aspects of genuine psychological development. Jung described the goal of individuation as the realization of the self, the capital S self, the totality of the psyche including both conscious and unconscious dimensions. This is not a destination reached and then maintained. It is an ongoing orientation, a continuous process of integrating what emerges from the unconscious into a more complete and honest conscious identity. Every integration changes the person slightly. Every integration shifts the relationship between that person and their social world slightly. And over time, the accumulated shifts produce a version of the person that is, in important ways, unrecognizable to the people who knew only the persona. This is not tragedy, but it is loss. And the loss is worth grieving before it can be integrated. Every relationship operates on a set of unspoken contracts. Not the contracts of conscious agreement, not the things you discussed and decided together, but the far more powerful contracts of expectation, role, and function that were established through years of consistent behavior. These contracts are rarely articulated because they rarely need to be. They exist in the automatic choreography of interaction. Who apologizes first, who raises difficult topics and who avoids them, who provides emotional regulation for the other, who shrinks to make space, who expands to fill silence. These contracts are the invisible architecture of relationship, and they are almost always built around the persona rather than the genuine self. When individuation begins to dissolve the persona, these contracts are violated, not through intention, not through malice, but through the simple fact that you are no longer the person who agreed to them. You are no longer able to provide the emotional regulation that was expected of you, because you have discovered that providing it came at the cost of your own emotional truth. You are no longer able to shrink into the space that was assigned to you, because the genuine self does not fit in that space. You are no longer able to perform the automatic apology that smoothed over conflict, because you have learned to distinguish between genuine accountability and the reflexive appeasement of someone who learned early that their own perspective was dangerous. The people who held the other side of these contracts experience their violation as betrayal, not because you intended to betray them, but because the contract was real to them even if it was never spoken. They had organized their expectations, their behavior, and sometimes their identity around your consistent fulfillment of your role. When you stop fulfilling it, they feel abandoned, even if you are still physically present, even if you have not gone anywhere, even if you are, in fact, more genuinely present than you have ever been. The version of you that showed up reliably is gone, and that loss is real for them, even if what replaced it is more honest. This dynamic is particularly acute in family systems. Families develop homeostatic mechanisms, ways of maintaining emotional equilibrium that depend on each member playing a specific role. the identified patient who carries the family's anxiety, the peacemaker who prevents conflict from escalating into rupture, the achiever whose success compensates for the family's collective sense of inadequacy, the invisible one whose effortlessness requires no attention and therefore leaves all the relational energy available for the more demanding members. These roles are assigned in childhood, before the child has any capacity to choose or refuse them, and they are maintained into adulthood through the family's unconscious pressure on each member to stay in their assigned position. When one member of the family system individuates, when they begin refusing their assigned role and claiming a more genuine identity, the system experiences it as crisis. The homeostasis is disrupted. The other members must either adapt their own roles or increase the pressure on the individuating member to return to their previous position. Most family systems choose pressure before adaptation. They pathologize the growth. They interpret the boundary as aggression. They experience the refusal of the role as a declaration of superiority. And so the individuating person faces a painful choice: continue the growth at the cost of the family's comfort, or retreat into the old role at the cost of their own. There is no version of this choice that is painless. There is something that happens in the presence of a person who has done genuine psychological work that is difficult to articulate, but unmistakable to experience. They are harder to manipulate, not because they are defensive, but because they can see the manipulation clearly and name it without drama. They are harder to shame, not because they are arrogant, but because they have already met the parts of themselves that shame targets and the meeting took the weapon away. They are harder to distract, not because they are rigid, but because they have developed a relationship with their own center that surface-level stimulation cannot easily displace. Their presence, in other words, is more substantial. And substantial presence in a world that runs largely on psychological avoidance is quietly threatening. People who have not done this work often experience the individuated person as somehow accusatory, not because the individuated person is saying anything critical, but because genuine presence functions as a mirror. When someone is fully in contact with their own reality, their simple presence creates a contrast with the psychological distances others maintain from theirs. The person who has suppressed their grief feels their grief more acutely in the presence of someone who has metabolized their own. The person who is avoiding a fundamental truth about their life feels that avoidance more clearly when the evasion is no longer being collectively maintained. This mirroring function is not something the individuated person chooses to perform. It is a consequence of their psychological state, but its effect on social dynamics is profound. Picture a common scene, a family dinner where someone makes a joke about a destructive pattern everyone pretends not to see, an uncle's drinking problem, a parent's empty marriage, the chronic anxiety the family calls just the way things are. Everyone laughs, but you can no longer laugh. Not because you have become too serious, but because you have gone deep enough to know what that laughter is covering. And your silence, without a single word spoken, functions as a mirror. The people around you feel it. And what they do with that discomfort is, almost always, blame your presence. The individuation process also tends to produce a quality of directness that social systems are not designed to accommodate. Most social interaction is structured around the management of uncomfortable truths, the maintenance of agreed-upon fictions that allow people to coexist without confronting the full complexity of their relationships and their lives. The individuated person, having spent considerable time confronting their own uncomfortable truths, tends to have a diminished tolerance for these collective fictions. Not a zero tolerance. Wisdom includes knowing when directness serves and when it damages, but a lower threshold for the automatic performance of false comfort. None of this means the individuated person is better than the people around them. It means they are different in ways that create friction. The friction is real, and it has social consequences. Invitations become less frequent. Conversations become more careful. The easy warmth of groups organized around shared avoidance becomes unavailable, because the individuated person can no longer participate in the avoidance that generates the warmth. What remains is something more genuine, but also, for a period that can last years, considerably more sparse. The social world contracts before it can expand into something more aligned with who the person has become. The hardest part of the social collapse that follows individuation is not the loss of acquaintances or the fading of shallow connections. Those losses, while real, carry a comprehensible logic. What is genuinely devastating is the loss, or the fundamental transformation, of relationships with people you love deeply, people you have known for decades, people who were present during the most formative experiences of your life, people whose history with you is woven into your own sense of who you are. The discovery that psychological growth can make you incompatible with people you genuinely love is one of the most destabilizing realizations in human experience. The incompatibility is not moral. This is crucial to understand. The person you have outgrown is not bad. They are not wrong. They are not less valuable as a human being. They are simply at a different place in their psychological development, a place that was yours not long ago, a place that made complete sense when you occupied it, a place that millions of people occupy their entire lives without anything being fundamentally wrong with them. The incompatibility is a difference in depth, in orientation toward the inner life, in willingness to sit with discomfort rather than resolve it through distraction or performance. What makes the grief particularly complex is that the relationship does not always end. Often it continues, in holidays and phone calls and the shared maintenance of connection, but it continues in a hollowed form. You are present, but not fully there. You are caring, but not fully nourished. You are going through the motions of a relationship that once contained you completely and now contains only a portion of you. The portion that still fits, the portion that can still meet the other person where they are. And you grieve, quietly and often alone, the fullness that is gone. There is also a specific grief that belongs to the relationships that tried to survive the change and couldn't, the friendships that went through a period of confusion and adjustment and eventually arrived at an honest reckoning, that the connection had been built on a shared avoidance that one person was no longer willing to maintain. These endings are rarely dramatic. They are usually quiet, a gradual reduction in contact, a growing awkwardness in conversations that used to be effortless, a mutual recognition, rarely spoken directly, that something has shifted too fundamentally to be bridged. Jung suggested that the individuation process requires what he called the sacrifice of the existing self, a giving up of the identity structures that have organized the psyche up to that point. What is less often discussed is that this sacrifice has relational dimensions. To individuate fully is to sacrifice not only the old self, but the social world that the old self inhabited. The relationships, the roles, the sense of belonging that the persona had cultivated and maintained. This is a genuine sacrifice in the original sense of the word. Something valuable, something real, something that mattered is given up. The fact that what grows in its place is more honest does not cancel the loss. It simply means the loss was worth it. And that is a very different thing from the loss not being real. There is a shadow dimension to the individuation process itself that is rarely discussed with the honesty it deserves. The person who has done genuine psychological work carries alongside their expanded consciousness and their more integrated self a new set of shadow contents that are specific to the individuation process and that can, if unexamined, produce precisely the kind of unconscious harm that the work was supposed to prevent. The shadow of the individuated person is not the same shadow they began with, but it is still a shadow, and it is often more subtle, more intellectually sophisticated, and therefore harder to catch than the original. The most common shadow content of the individuated person is superiority. Not the crude, obvious superiority of contempt that is too visible to survive the scrutiny that genuine psychological work tends to produce. It is a subtler superiority, the quiet certainty that the way you are now relating to your inner life is the correct way, the mature way, the way that everyone would relate to their inner life if they were brave enough and honest enough to do the work. This superiority is rarely expressed directly. It lives in a particular quality of patience, the patience of someone who has decided they are waiting for others to catch up. This shadow content is particularly dangerous because it can masquerade as wisdom. The individuated person has genuinely learned things through their process that many people around them have not yet learned. That learning is real, but the shadow converts the learning into a credential, into evidence of a fundamental difference in value or development between the self and others. And once that conversion happens, the individuated person begins to use their psychological development in the same way that less conscious people use wealth or social status, as a measure of worth, as a justification for distance. There is also a shadow content around the social collapse itself. The loneliness of the individuation process, while genuinely painful, can become a source of identity, proof of depth, evidence of the distance traveled, a badge of the suffering endured in service of genuine growth. When loneliness becomes identity, the person unconsciously begins to maintain it. They interpret potential connections through a lens that emphasizes incompatibility. They find evidence of unconsciousness in people who might actually be capable of genuine meeting. Jung was clear that individuation does not produce a finished product. The integrated person is not immune to the unconscious. They are simply in a more conscious and ongoing relationship with it. The shadow of the individuated person requires the same honesty and the same willingness to look that the original shadow work required. The difference is that this shadow is harder to see precisely because it is dressed in the language of psychological health, superiority that calls itself discernment, isolation that calls itself selectivity, grief that has calcified into identity. These are the specific shadow traps of the person who has done enough work to be genuinely dangerous to themselves in new and more sophisticated ways. Jung himself knew the particular loneliness of the individuation process from the inside. The years he described in his autobiography as his confrontation with the unconscious, the period following his rupture with Freud, during which he descended into the depths of his own psyche through active imagination and dream work, were years of profound social isolation. He withdrew from most of his professional relationships. He built a stone tower at Bollingen without electricity or running water, and spent long periods there alone. This was not depression, though it may have resembled it from the outside. It was the social consequence of a psychological process that had taken him somewhere that very few people around him could follow. What Jung discovered in that solitude was not that connection was impossible, but that the quality of connection available to him had fundamentally changed. The connections that had been built on shared professional identity, shared theoretical frameworks, shared social performances. These could not survive the radical honesty of what he was going through. But new connections eventually became possible. Connections built on a different foundation. Not on what he and another person had in common as social beings, but on what they shared as psychological beings. A willingness to take the inner life seriously, a tolerance for depth and ambiguity, a respect for the mystery of the unconscious. Jung wrote that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. This is the precise description of the post-individuation social experience. The things that seem important, the inner movements, the dreams, the slow integrations, the discoveries made in descent, are not communicable to people who have not undergone something similar. Not because the individuated person has become arrogant or exclusive, but because the language for these experiences is not part of ordinary social vocabulary. But Jung also wrote about what he called the objective psyche, the understanding that the inner experiences of the individual, however personal they feel, are in fact connected to something much larger. The archetypes that organize the unconscious are not personal creations. They are universal structures, shared across humanity, appearing in myths and dreams and religious imagery across cultures and centuries. This means that the deepest experiences of individuation, the most interior, the most private, the most impossible to communicate, are also, paradoxically, the most universally human. This is the promise that sustains the individuated person through the social collapse. Not that the old connections will be restored, but that new connections of a different quality and a different depth, become possible precisely because of what has been lost. The people who eventually find their way to each other after the collapse are not the ones who knew only the persona. They are people who have undergone something similar, who are navigating their own confrontation with the unconscious, and recognize, in another's presence, a map they can use together. The quality of those connections is different from anything that came before. More sparse, more demanding, and more genuinely nourishing. The social collapse that follows individuation is not the end of social life. It is the end of a particular kind of social life, the kind built on persona, on shared avoidance, on the unconscious contracts of role and function. What becomes possible after that collapse, once the grief has been genuinely metabolized and the loneliness has been honestly inhabited rather than frantically escaped, is something that most people never experience. Connection, based on genuine psychological meeting. Not the performance of intimacy, but intimacy itself. Not the comfort of being known as your persona, but the rarer and more nourishing experience of being known as your actual self. These new connections arrive differently than the old ones did. They do not arrive through proximity, through school, neighborhood, workplace, the accidents of geography that produce most social bonds. They arrive through resonance, through the recognition, in another person's words or work or presence, of someone who has traveled somewhere similar. They arrive through the specific quality of attention that one person who has done psychological work extends to another. The attention that is not performing interest, but actually interested. That is not performing presence, but actually present. The individuation process also creates the possibility of a different relationship with solitude itself. Most people experience solitude as a deficit, the absence of connection, the failure to be with others. The individuated person, having been forced into a solitude they did not choose, often discovers within it something that was not available in the noise of social performance, a relationship with their own inner life that is sustaining in ways that social life often is not. Jung called this the experience of the self, the encounter with the deeper center of the psyche that is not dependent on external validation for its sense of reality and worth. What distinguishes these new friendships is not only what they can tolerate, it is what they require from you. They require you to show up without the shield of performance, to say, "I don't know," when you don't know, to admit when you are afraid, when you are confused, when the process is costing you more than you expected. This kind of presence is harder than the social competence the persona always offered, but it is precisely this difficulty that makes the connection real. Because two people meeting without their personas are meeting each other for the first time, perhaps genuinely. This is what the social world looks like on the other side of the collapse. Smaller, more deliberate, more genuinely nourishing. Not the broad social warmth of belonging to a group that accepts you because you fulfill your role within it, but the specific warmth of being known by a few people who see you clearly and choose to stay anyway. Jung described this kind of connection as a meeting of two worlds, two people bringing their full inner reality into contact with each other, rather than two personas performing the social choreography of relationship. It is rarer than ordinary connection. It is more demanding, and it is, in the experience of everyone who has found it, worth every moment of the loneliness that preceded it. The first thing required to survive the social collapse of individuation is the one thing the collapse makes most difficult: honesty about what is actually happening. Not the honesty of complaint, not the rehearsal of grievances about the people who have failed to grow at the pace you have grown, or the relationships that proved unable to contain your development, but the deeper honesty of genuine accounting. What have I lost, and what is the grief that belongs to that loss? This accounting is essential because unacknowledged grief does not disappear. It converts. It becomes resentment or contempt, or the subtle superiority discussed in the previous chapter. The second requirement is the development of patience with a timeline that cannot be controlled. The new connections, the ones built on genuine psychological meeting rather than on shared persona, do not arrive on demand. They arrive when they arrive, which is often long after the old connections have faded and the loneliness has become a familiar companion. The impulse to fill the social void quickly, to find new groups, new communities, new belonging structures that will replace what was lost, is understandable, but often counterproductive. The replacement connections, formed from loneliness rather than from genuine resonance, tend to replicate the patterns of the old ones. The third requirement is the maintenance of what might be called graduated disclosure, the practice of revealing the depth of your inner life incrementally rather than completely. This is not the same as hiding yourself. It is the recognition that depth, offered too fully and too quickly to people who are not yet in a position to receive it, tends to produce the discomfort and distance discussed earlier. The individuated person must develop a capacity for meeting people where they are, for engaging genuinely with the level of depth that is available in a given relationship, without either performing shallowness they no longer feel or demanding a depth the other person cannot yet offer. The fourth requirement is a willingness to grieve the social world that has been lost without converting that grief into a verdict on the people who inhabited it. The people who could not follow you into your development are not failures. The relationships that could not survive your growth are not evidence that those relationships were never real. They were real. They mattered. They served their purpose in the chapter of your life in which they existed. Allowing them to have been genuinely valuable, while also acknowledging that they could not continue, is one of the most emotionally sophisticated things the individuation process demands. Each of these requirements points in the same direction, not outward, searching for replacements for what was lost, but inward, toward a more honest relationship with the process itself. And it is precisely in that direction, interior, patient, unforced, that the deeper belonging eventually begins to reveal itself. Not as a reward for effort, as the natural consequence of who you become when you stop trying to control what cannot be controlled. What Chapter 9 pointed toward, that interior direction, that trust in the process, that patience which is not passivity but active practice, reveals something that is very difficult to name from inside the collapse, but becomes clearer in retrospect. It reveals a different understanding of what belonging actually is. The belonging that most people pursue, the belonging of group membership, of role fulfillment, of social acceptance, is a belonging to the surface. It requires the maintenance of a consistent persona, the suppression of the parts that do not fit. It provides warmth and comfort and the relief of not being alone. And it costs the self, slowly, quietly, continuously, the price of the suppression required to maintain it. The belonging that becomes available after the collapse is different in kind, not just in degree. It is a belonging that does not require suppression, a belonging to a few people who know the actual self, the self that emerged from the individuation process, the self that includes the shadow and the grief and the complexity and the specific kind of depth that the persona was constructed to conceal. This belonging is more demanding than the surface kind, because it requires the courage of actual visibility. It requires allowing yourself to be seen without the protection of the persona, with all the uncertainty and imperfection and ongoing incompletion that genuine selfhood involves. There is also a belonging that transcends the social entirely, the belonging that Jung pointed toward when he wrote about the connection between the individual psyche and the larger patterns of human experience encoded in the collective unconscious. When the individuated person encounters a myth that describes their experience with uncanny precision, when they read a poem written centuries ago that articulates something they thought was too particular, too interior, too strange to have ever been felt by anyone else, they experience a form of belonging that does not depend on the presence of another living person. They belong to the larger conversation of human consciousness across time. This is the belonging that sustains the individuated person through the years when the social world is sparse and the loneliness is acute. Not as a substitute for human connection, it cannot replace the warmth of genuine human meeting, but as a context that makes the loneliness bearable. You are not alone in your aloneness. The specific shape of your isolation has been inhabited by others before you. The grief you are carrying has been carried in different forms by every person who has ever chosen depth over comfort, reality over performance, genuine selfhood over social acceptance. You are, in your solitude, part of a tradition. If you are in the social collapse right now, if you are living in the specific loneliness of having grown beyond the world that was built around an older version of you, then what you most need to hear is not that it will end quickly. It may not. It may take years. What you need to hear is that the loneliness is not evidence of failure. It is not evidence that the inner work was wrong, or that you have made yourself unlovable, or that genuine connection is no longer available to you. It is evidence that you are in a genuine process, a process that has always cost what it is costing you, a process that has always felt from inside exactly the way it feels to you right now, and a process that has always eventually opened into something that could not have been reached any other way. You did not lose the world. You are between worlds, and that is one of the most human places it is possible to be.